Hello everyone and welcome to the second tutorial about our Restlessness framework. In the first video we saw how to install the command line interface, how to create a new project and how to start the development. We saw that by launching the development, Restlessness opens for us a web user interface that we can use to actually create, modify and delete resources in our project. We created the first endpoint that was a get users method, and in this video tutorial we will go to create new endpoints and we will check how to interact with the endpoints parameters. We have mainly three kind of parameters: query strings, path parameters and payload, and we will go through all of them. So first of all, let's launch our project and we can open our web interface. Alright, so as we can see in the endpoints, the get users is already handled. We saw in the last video tutorial how to define query string parameters like this limit, and in the validations the limit is actually a number and it is required. We also specified it should be an integer. So let's go back to our web interface and open Swagger. Swagger calls the get open API endpoint that it returns the open API JSON description. So thanks to that JSON, our Swagger interface is able to list all the endpoints that we created automatically and to also automatically acquire all the parameters. So let's click here, try it out, and if we execute like this without specifying any limit, we receive the error message thanks to this validation here. As you can see, message, validation result message, that warns us that the limit field is required, but we didn't specify. So let's put something like hello. We execute it. And Swagger didn't allow us to submit like this because limit should be a number and we are putting in a string. So let's put something like 12, we execute, and as you can see now everything is working just fine. The server response code is 200, that means everything was okay, and we are also retrieving the array of our users, the mocked one that we just created. So the first endpoint works just fine, and now we can move to creating a second endpoint. So imagine that for the same route users, now we want to define a post to actually create a new users. So let's save the endpoints. We can go back here, and inside our endpoints folder, post users has been created. Let's already refresh our environment, because every time we create a new endpoint we have to actually refresh and let the serverless offline plugin to actually reload all the endpoints, and then we can go to the interfaces file inside the post users folder. So as you can see here, now we have a new extra interface that Restlessness created for us, that is the payload one. So thanks to this payload interface, now we can specify a body or a payload for our endpoint. So since we are assuming that our user object is composed by a name and an age, let's define these two variables that we need. Name as a string and age as a number. Okay. Now we don't want any specific query string parameters for a post, so we can ignore that and we can go to the validations. As you can see, the validations is already giving us an error because the payload, we actually specified two variables and we said also that they are required because we didn't put the question mark, but we are not specifying any validation here. So let's specify it. Name, string required. We can even specify 3 characters minimum and 8 maximum, and then we can put age as a number, maybe an integer, and we can say that the minimum age allowed is 18, and we want even a maximum age that is 120. So let's save it. Now TypeScript accept our validations. So now we can open back our Swagger, and as we can see, Restlessness updated our OpenAPI JSON file by adding the new post users endpoint. If we open this endpoint and we click on try it out, we can actually specify our body. As you can see, Restlessness is already preparing for us a template with the name and age, because one of the main features of Restlessness, it is to go through the validation file, and by just analyzing the payload, the query strings, the path parameters, validation objects, it can create for us this template that are really comfortable to test our endpoints. So let's put as a name maybe A, and as an age let's leave 0, and let's try to execute our endpoint. So of course we have some error message. The first one is age must be greater than or equal to 18. We specified 0, and so this is of course an error. So let's put 19, execute again. Now we have another error. Name must be at least 3 characters, and we specified just 1. If we remove name at all, name is a required field, so all the validations are working just fine. So let's put Antonio and some number, and we have now again name must be at most 8 characters. So let's remove everything. So now we have a 7 characters length name, and if we execute, the response answer is 200. We don't have any response body, so everything worked just fine. So if we go to our post users interface, post users handler, we can, for example, go here, and we will see that in our payload, TypeScript is correctly reading our variables. If we want to add a new one, of course it is an error because there is no limit variable in our payload. And here we can, for example, retrieve our user with the same name and age that we just read from our payload. So if we go back here and we execute the same, now also our endpoint is returning us back to the same object with the same variable we passed to it. So everything is working just fine. So let's play a little bit else with another endpoint now. What if we want to actually modify our user? So let's create users. Here we want to specify the ID of a specific user. So in order to do that, we can add the curly brackets, and inside we can put a parameter, in this case user ID. The method will be put, and we can save it like this. As you can see here, already the name of the function it changed a little bit, because now it keeps in mind that there is a parameter. So Restlessness recognizes these curly brackets as a parameter, and the name it is method plus route plus by parameter. So put users by user ID, and this is of course the user ID strings that Restlessness read to create this string. So let's go back in our endpoints. Again, we can refresh our environment, and the new put users by user ID is created. Let's go to the interfaces. Since the parameters are already included in our route, Restlessness can recognize it automatically. So as you can see here in the path parameters, this new interface that we have, Restlessness already put user ID as a string for us. And then we can go maybe here and specifying again the name. We can assume that for some reason we don't want to modify the age. We can just modify the name of our user, and of course we will pass off the path parameter our user ID that is a string. So let's go back to the validation file. Now we have just one error that is still in the payload because Restlessness didn't know that we have also a name string. So let's add it. But as you can see here in the path parameters validations, our user ID parameter is already specified, and it is a string, and it should be also required because since we want that route in that exact way, we want the user ID parameter to be actually specified. So we can save this. We can go back to our Swagger. We can open the put endpoint that has been already created. And now, as you can see, we have two parameters to specify, a path parameter and the payload. So here we can put, for example, 120, that can be even also a string. As the name, we can say Giorgio. If we execute, as you can see, the response is 200. Of course, we are not returning anything yet from our endpoint because we are actually not doing anything special. But as you can see, we are receiving a new parameter here that are the path parameters. So we can do like this, path parameters, and automatically suggest for us user ID. We can read again the name from the payload. And here we can return a user object, maybe with our user ID and the name we specified. So if we go back here and we execute again, we will receive our user with user ID 120, that, as you can see, now it is a string because we specified it should be a string, and our name Giorgio. So everything works just fine. But if our put endpoint, if you want, we can even add a query string just to have all the parameters in one endpoint, and we can say like as a query string parameter, let's specify again a limit that in this case it doesn't have much sense, it is just for testing purposes. Let's go to validation. We can specify limit. As a required field. We can save. Now let's refresh our Swagger. If we open our put and try it out, as you can see, now we have three kind of parameters. User ID in the path, limit in the query string parameters, and our request body with our name field. So in this lecture we saw how to create different kind of endpoints and how to manipulate these parameters. If we want to include also a delete endpoint, it is not much different. We can say, for example, we want to delete a specific user like this, and when we save the delete acts as a get parameter, so it doesn't have any payload, but in this example it has a path parameter. So in the next video tutorial we will start to manipulate maybe some model, and we will include some basic database access, so we can actually have a data source to manipulate with our endpoints and to start testing some really basic CRUD, create, read, update, delete operations.